The rifle barrel pressed cold against Elijah Lang's shoulder as he watched the woman in buckskin crouch beside the creek, running through his forest, her fingers working carefully around the roots of wild ginger. She had no idea he was there, standing still as the pines themselves, watching her trespass on land he had claimed 5 years ago when he first came to these Montana mountains, north of Virginia City. The year was 1875, and most folks knew better than to wander into the territory of a mountain man, especially one with Elijah's reputation for solitude and silence. But here she was, dark hair braided down her back, a worn canvas bag slung across her shoulder, gathering herbs like she had every right to be there. He should have called out, warned her off, sent her running back down the mountain to wherever she came from. Instead, Elijah lowered his rifle and stepped from behind the lodgepole pine, his boots making just enough noise on the forest floor to announce his presence without startling her too badly. She froze, her hand still wrapped around a stem of wild ginger, and slowly turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were the color of warm honey, wide with surprise but not fear, and that interested him more than it should have. "You are on private land," Elijah said, his voice rough from disuse. He spoke so rarely these days that the words felt strange in his mouth. The woman stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees, and faced him fully. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe 23 or 24, with a face that spoke of determination rather than delicate beauty. "I did not know anyone claimed this forest," she said, her voice steady despite the fact that he stood a foot taller than her. His shoulders broad beneath his buckskin shirt, his dark hair falling past his collar, muscles built from years of splitting wood and hauling game. "I thought it was open territory." "It is not." Elijah shifted his weight, the rifle hanging loose in his hand now, no longer a threat. "What are you gathering?" She glanced down at her bag, then back up at him as if weighing whether to answer. "Herbs for medicine." "I am a healer of sorts, and the herbs down in Virginia City are picked over. I needed to come higher up the mountain." "A healer." He considered this, studying her more carefully. Her clothes were worn but clean, practical rather than fashionable, and her hands showed the signs of hard work. "From Virginia City, from a small settlement about 10 miles south of there. My name is Willa Adams." She did not offer her hand, which was wise, given that they were strangers in the wilderness and he still held a rifle, Elijah Lang. He did not know why he told her his name. He had not introduced himself to anyone in more than a year. "You should not come up here alone. There are bears, mountain lions, dangerous men too. Are you a dangerous man?" Willa asked, tilting her head slightly, those honey-colored eyes studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "That depends on your definition of dangerous," Elijah said. He gestured toward the creek. "Finish your gathering, but be quick about it." He watched as surprise flickered across her face, followed by something that might have been gratitude. She knelt again by the water, working more quickly now, her fingers nimble as she harvested the ginger root and moved on to a patch of yarrow growing near a fallen log. Elijah remained where he was, rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his eyes scanning the forest out of habit. He had learned long ago to always watch his surroundings, to never let his guard down completely. "Why are you letting me stay?" Willa asked after several minutes of silence. "I have not decided yet," Elijah answered, which was not entirely true. He had already decided the moment he saw the competent way she handled the plants, the respect she showed for the forest, taking only what she needed and leaving the roots intact so they would grow again. "How often do you need to come up here?" Willa sat back on her heels, looking up at him. "Once a week, maybe twice if I am treating someone with a serious illness. The herbs I need do not grow in the lower elevations." And you came alone today. I always come alone. My father died 2 years ago. My mother before that. I have no brothers or sisters, no husband to accompany me." She said it matter-of-factly without self-pity, but Elijah heard the loneliness beneath the words. He recognized it because it matched his own. "You should not come alone," he said again, more firmly this time. "Next time I will expect you. Come on Wednesdays and Saturdays, morning only. Stay on this side of the creek, do not wander toward the north ridge. That is where I set my traps." Willa stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder. It looked heavier now, full of the plants she had gathered. "You would let me come back, truly." "I just said so, did I not?" Elijah turned away, uncomfortable with the gratitude shining in her eyes. "Go on now. The afternoon brings storms this time of year." He heard her footsteps on the path, moving away down the mountain, and he did not turn to watch her go. Instead, he stood by the creek where she had been kneeling, looking at the disturbed earth where she had carefully harvested the wild ginger, leaving enough root that the plant would survive and thrive. She knew what she was doing, this Willa Adams. She understood the forest in a way that most people did not. Elijah returned to his cabin as the first clouds began to gather over the peaks, his mind occupied with thoughts of honey-colored eyes and capable hands. He had come to these mountains to escape people, to leave behind the noise and demands of civilization, and yet he had just invited someone to return to his forest. It made no sense, but then again, very little in his life had made sense since the war ended 10 years ago, and he found himself unable to settle back into the life he had left behind in Ohio. The cabin he had built sat in a small clearing, surrounded by pines and aspens, with a view down the valley that allowed him to see anyone approaching from miles away. It was solid and weatherproof, chinked tight against the Montana winters, with a stone fireplace that drew well and kept the single room warm even in the worst storms. He had built it with his own hands, cutting and hauling every log, and it suited him perfectly. There was space for his bed, a table and chairs he had made from pine, shelves for his supplies and hooks for his gear. It was simple and functional, and it was his. That night, as rain drummed on the roof, Elijah lay in his bed and thought about Willa Adams trespassing in his forest. He thought about the way she had not shown fear when she saw him, only caution and respect. Most people looked at him and saw something frightening in his size and silence, in the muscles built from years of hard labor, and the way he preferred to keep apart from civilization. But Willa had looked at him and asked if he was dangerous, as if she were genuinely curious rather than afraid. Wednesday came with clear skies and cool morning air. Elijah told himself he had work to do, traps to check and wood to split, but he found himself near the creek at the time when morning light filtered golden through the trees. He heard her coming before he saw her, her footsteps careful on the path, and then she emerged into the clearing by the water, wearing the same buckskin clothing, carrying the same canvas bag. She stopped when she saw him standing there, and a smile crossed her face that transformed her from determined to beautiful. "Good morning," she said. "I was not certain you meant it about letting me return." "I keep my word," Elijah said, perhaps more gruffly than necessary. "What are you gathering today?" "Willow bark, if I can find any, and more yarrow. There is a family in the settlement with fever, and I am running low on supplies." She moved past him toward the creek, then paused and looked back. "Would you show me where the willow grows? I do not want to wander too far and disturb your traps." Elijah hesitated, then nodded. He led her upstream, following the creek as it wound through the forest, until they reached a spot where several willows grew along the bank, their branches trailing in the current. He stood back as Willa knelt and began carefully stripping bark from the younger branches, her movements efficient and practiced. "My father taught me about herbs," she said, not looking at him as she worked. "He learned from his mother, who was a healer in Pennsylvania before they moved west. I have been gathering and mixing medicine since I was old enough to walk." "Why did you come to Montana?" Elijah asked, surprising himself with the question. He did not usually care about other people's stories. "For the same reason everyone comes west. A new start, new opportunities. My father thought he could find work in the mines, but he was not suited to that life. He was a farmer at heart. We tried to start a farm in the valley, but the land was not good, and he worked himself to death trying to make it produce." Willa sat back, her bag now containing strips of willow bark. "What about you? What brought you to these mountains?" "The war," Elijah said simply. "And what came after?" She looked up at him then, and he saw understanding in her eyes. "You fought for 3 years. Ohio infantry. I came home and found I did not fit anymore. Could not stand being around people, could not stand the noise and the questions. I headed west and kept going until I found a place where I could be alone." "But you are not sending me away," Willa said softly. "Why?" Elijah crossed his arms over his chest, aware of how the movement made his muscles shift beneath his shirt, aware of how her eyes followed the motion. "I have not decided yet," he said again, using the same words he had used 3 days ago. "Maybe I am getting soft in my old age." "How old are you?" Willa asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. 32, you?" 24. She stood, brushing off her knees again. It seemed to be a habit of hers. "Not so old then, though you carry yourself like someone much older." "War does that," Elijah said, "ages you." They walked back down the creek together, and Elijah found himself pointing out plants and landmarks without really thinking about it. He showed her where the best ginger grew, where she could find wild mint in the summer, which paths were safe, and which ones led toward his trap lines. Willa listened carefully, asking intelligent questions, and Elijah realized he was talking more in this single morning than he had in the past 6 months combined. When they reached the spot where the creek met the main path down the mountain, Willa turned to him. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me gather here, for showing me the willow. I know you value your privacy, and I promise not to abuse the privilege. Come on Saturday if you need more," Elijah said. "Same time." He watched her walk down the path until she disappeared among the trees, then turned back toward his cabin. The forest felt different somehow, less empty than it had before, and he was not sure how he felt about that. He had chosen solitude deliberately, had built his life around being alone, and yet he found himself already looking forward to Saturday morning. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Willa came twice a week, always in the morning, always careful to stay on the agreed-upon side of the creek. Sometimes Elijah was there waiting, and sometimes he pretended to be checking traps nearby, but he always knew when she arrived. They talked more each time, though calling it conversation was generous. Mostly, Willa talked and Elijah listened, offering occasional comments or answering her questions with his typical brevity. She told him about the settlement where she lived, a collection of families trying to make a living through farming and trade. She described the people she treated, the children with coughs and fevers, the men injured in accidents, the women worn down by the hardness of frontier life. She spoke about her garden where she grew herbs when she could, about her small cabin that had been her father's, and now was hers alone. Elijah learned that she was practical and intelligent, that she had a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard, that she was lonely but did not complain about it. In turn, she learned that he had been a carpenter before the war, that he trapped and hunted for his living now, selling furs in Virginia City a few times a year. She learned that he had no family left, that his parents had died while he was fighting, and his younger sister had married and moved to California. She discovered that, beneath his gruff exterior and intimidating size, he was thoughtful and observant, that he knew the forest intimately and respected it deeply. It was on a Saturday in late September when everything changed. Elijah was checking his snares on the east ridge when he heard a sound that did not belong in the forest. A harsh male voice followed by Willa's raised in protest. He ran toward the creek, his long legs covering ground quickly, and emerged into the clearing to find Willa backing away from two men he recognized from Virginia City. They were miners, rough types who spent their money on whiskey and cards, and they had clearly followed her up the mountain. "We just want to talk, sweetheart," the taller one was saying, his smile ugly. "Real friendly like. I have told you I have nothing to say to you. Leave me alone." Willa's voice was firm, but Elijah could hear the fear underneath. "Now that is not very neighborly," the second man said, reaching for her arm. Elijah stepped into the clearing and both men froze. He knew what they saw. A man who stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad as an axe handle and arms thick with muscle from years of hard work. His dark hair was loose around his face, and he had not shaved in a week. He looked exactly like what he was, a mountain man who did not welcome strangers on his land. "The lady asked you to leave," Elijah said, his voice low and dangerous. "You should listen." The taller miner took a step back. "We did not know she belonged to anyone. We thought she was alone. She is not alone. She is on my land under my protection. You need to leave. Now." Elijah did not raise his voice, did not need to. The threat in his tone was clear enough. Both men left quickly, stumbling over each other in their haste to get down the mountain. Elijah watched until they disappeared from sight, then turned to Willa. She was standing very still, her arms wrapped around herself, and he could see her hands trembling. "Are you hurt?" he asked, moving toward her slowly, not wanting to frighten her further. "No, they did not touch me, but they followed me from the settlement. I did not realize until I was already halfway up the mountain." Her voice shook slightly, and she took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm herself. "I should not have come today. I should have known better." "You have every right to come here," Elijah said firmly. "This is not your fault. Those men should not have followed you." Willa looked up at him, and he saw tears threatening in her honey-colored eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "Thank you for stopping them. I do not know what they would have done if you had not been here." "I will walk you back," Elijah said, making a decision in that moment. "And from now on I will meet you at the base of the mountain. You should not walk alone anymore. You do not have to do that. It is a long walk, and I know you value your privacy." "I am doing it anyway," Elijah said. "Gather what you came for, then I will take you home." They walked together down the mountain, Elijah keeping watch for any sign of the miners, though he doubted they would return. Willa was quiet, the scare having shaken her more than she wanted to admit, and Elijah found himself wanting to comfort her, but not knowing how. He had spent so many years avoiding human contact that he had forgotten how to offer reassurance. When they reached the settlement, Willa stopped at the edge of the small cluster of cabins and turned to him. "This is where I live," she said, pointing to a cabin set slightly apart from the others, with a small garden plot beside it. "Thank you for walking with me. I appreciate your kindness." "It is not kindness," Elijah said. "It is common sense. I will be here Wednesday morning early to walk up with you. Elijah, you really do not have to go to that trouble. It is not trouble." He looked down at her, at the way the afternoon sun caught in her dark hair, at the lingering fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide. "I will be here Wednesday. Be ready." He left before she could argue further, taking the long route back to his mountain so he could think. The incident with the miners had shaken something loose in him, some protective instinct he thought he had left behind in the war. The idea of those men touching Willa, of hurting her, filled him with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. She had become something more than just a trespasser he tolerated, more than an acquaintance who gathered herbs in his forest. She had become someone he cared about, someone he wanted to protect, and that realization both thrilled and terrified him. Wednesday morning came cold and clear, with frost on the grass and breath misting in the air. Elijah arrived at Willa's cabin as the sun was just beginning to light the eastern sky. She was ready, wrapped in a woolen shawl over her buckskin dress, her canvas bag empty and waiting to be filled. She smiled when she saw him, a genuine smile of welcome that made something warm unfold in his chest. "Good morning," she said. "You came." "I said I would." He gestured toward the path. Ready, they walked together through the forest, the silence between them comfortable now rather than awkward. Elijah noticed things he had not noticed before. The graceful way Willa moved through the trees, her careful footsteps that barely disturbed the fallen leaves, the way she paused to observe a bird or admire the way light filtered through the pines. She belonged in the forest almost as much as he did, he realized. She understood it, respected it, loved it. At the creek, while Willa gathered herbs, Elijah found himself sitting on a fallen log nearby, watching her work. She glanced up occasionally, offering comments about what she was finding, and he responded with more words than he had used in years. They talked about the coming winter, about how much snow the mountains would get, about preparing for the cold months ahead. Willa mentioned that her cabin was not well chinked and would be drafty once the real cold set in. "I could fix that," Elijah heard himself say. "If you want, I am good with that kind of work." Willa looked at him, surprise clear on her face. "You would do that. It is just chinking." "Would not take long." He felt uncomfortable suddenly, wondering if he had overstepped. "Only if you want." "I would appreciate that more than you know," Willa said softly. "I have been dreading winter. Last year was so cold and I used so much firewood trying to keep warm." "I will come by next week," Elijah said. "Take a look at what needs doing." True to his word, he arrived at her cabin the following Tuesday with his tools and materials. He spent the day working while Willa went about her business, treating a child with a cough and an old man with arthritis. When she returned in the afternoon, she found Elijah on the roof, replacing shingles that had blown loose in summer storms. "You did not have to fix the roof," she called up to him. "It needed fixing," he called back. "No sense chinking the walls if the rain is going to come through the roof." She made him supper that night, insisting that it was the least she could do after all his work. They ate together at her small table, venison stew with wild onions and potatoes from her garden, and Elijah realized it was the first time he had shared a meal with another person since coming to Montana. It felt strange and intimate and surprisingly pleasant. "Why did you really come to the mountains?" Willa asked as they ate. The truth this time, not just the war and what came after. Elijah was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "I killed a lot of men during the war," he finally said. "Did things that needed doing at the time but that I cannot forget. When I came home, I would wake up fighting invisible enemies. I could not stand crowds or sudden noises. My own family treated me like I was dangerous, like I might snap at any moment. Maybe they were right. I left before I could hurt anyone, came west and found these mountains. Up here, the only danger is natural. Animals and weather and my own mistakes. It makes sense in a way that war never did." Willa reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her fingers small and warm against his scarred knuckles. "I do not think you are dangerous," she said. "I think you are the safest person I know." Elijah looked down at her hand on his, unable to remember the last time someone had touched him with kindness. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Willa said. "I know you could have sent me away that first day, but you let me stay. I know you have protected me and helped me, asked nothing in return. I know you live alone because you think that is what you deserve, but you are wrong about that. Willa." He said her name like a warning, but he did not pull his hand away. "I am not afraid of you, Elijah Lang. I am not afraid of what you have done or what you think you are. I see who you are now, and I like what I see." She squeezed his hand gently, then pulled away, standing to clear the dishes. "Stay for a while. It is getting dark, and you should not walk in the forest at night." He should have left. He should have thanked her for the meal and gone back to his mountain, back to his solitary life. Instead, Elijah stayed, sitting by her fireplace while she worked on preparing herbs for medicine, tying bundles of yarrow and willow bark to dry from the rafters. They talked quietly, easily, and when the fire burned low and the cabin grew dark except for the glow of embers, he finally stood to leave. At the door, Willa touched his arm. "Thank you," she said, "for fixing my cabin, for everything." "I will finish the chinking on Saturday," Elijah said, very aware of her hand on his arm, of how close she was standing. "After you gather your herbs." "I will look forward to it," Willa said, and in the dim light her eyes seemed to glow golden. Elijah walked back to his mountain under a sky full of stars, his mind full of thoughts he had not allowed himself in years. He had told himself he wanted solitude, that he needed to be alone, but the truth was he had been afraid. Afraid of hurting someone, afraid of letting someone see the darkness inside him, afraid of caring about someone and losing them the way he had lost so many during the war. But Willa had looked at that darkness and had not turned away. She had taken his hand and told him he was safe, and something in him had cracked open at those words. The weeks passed, turning into months, and Elijah found himself spending more and more time at Willa's cabin. He fixed everything that needed fixing, reinforced her woodshed, built her a new table when the old one collapsed. He brought her venison and elk, ensuring she had meat for the winter, and she fed him meals that warmed more than just his stomach. They fell into a rhythm together, an easy partnership that felt natural and right. Winter came hard and early that year, with snow falling thick in November and temperatures dropping below zero. Elijah worried about Willa alone in her cabin, despite all the repairs he had made, and found excuses to check on her frequently. The trips down the mountain became longer, and soon he was spending as much time at the settlement as he was at his own cabin. It was during a particularly fierce storm in December that everything came to a head. Elijah had arrived at Willa's cabin in the afternoon, concerned about how much snow was falling, only to find her struggling with a chimney that had stopped drawing properly, filling the cabin with smoke. He climbed onto the roof in the blowing snow, cleared the blockage, and nearly fell on the ice when he was climbing down. Willa caught him at the bottom of the ladder, and they both tumbled into a snowbank, tangled together. They lay there for a moment, breathless and cold, snow falling on their faces. Then Willa started laughing, and Elijah found himself laughing too, a sound so rusty from disuse that it hardly sounded like laughter at all. They helped each other up and stumbled inside, brushing snow from their clothes and hair. "You could have been killed," Willa scolded, helping him out of his wet coat, "climbing around on an icy roof in a blizzard." "I was not going to let you freeze," Elijah said, "or suffocate from smoke." "You are not going back up the mountain tonight," Willa said firmly. "The storm is getting worse. You will stay here." "Willa, I cannot. It would not be proper." "Proper," she laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Elijah, we live on the frontier. The nearest town is 10 miles away. There is no one here to judge us for propriety. You will stay, and that is final. I will not have you dying in a snowstorm because you were worried about my reputation." He stayed. He slept on the floor by the fireplace while Willa took her bed, but he did not sleep much. He lay awake listening to the wind howl outside, to the soft sound of Willa's breathing, and thought about how much his life had changed since the day he found her gathering herbs in his forest. He had been existing, not living, going through the motions of survival without any real purpose. Now he had a reason to come down from his mountain, a reason to interact with the world again. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world buried in fresh snow that sparkled in the sunlight. Elijah woke to find Willa already up, making breakfast, and they ate together in comfortable silence. When it was time for him to leave, she walked him to the door, and there was something in her eyes that made him pause. "Elijah," she said softly, "I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "Why do you keep coming here? And do not say it is just to fix things or check on me. Tell me the real reason." He looked down at her, at this woman who had somehow worked her way past all his defenses, and he knew he had to tell her the truth. "Because when I am with you, I do not feel like a broken man trying to hide from the world. I feel like myself again, or maybe a better version of myself. Because you make me laugh, and you make me talk, and you make me want to be part of life again instead of just watching it pass by." Willa's eyes were bright with tears. "I am glad," she whispered, "because I have fallen in love with you, and I was hoping you might feel the same way." Elijah reached out with one hand and cupped her cheek, his palm rough against her soft skin. "I do," he said, the words coming easier than he expected. "I love you, Willa Adams. I think I started loving you the day you asked if I was dangerous and were not afraid of the answer." She rose on her toes and kissed him, and Elijah wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She fit perfectly against him, her head tucked beneath his chin, and he thought about how strong she was, how brave to love a man like him. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Willa was smiling up at him. "So what do we do now?" she asked. "Now I go back to my cabin and think about how to ask you properly to be my wife," Elijah said. "Because that is what I want if you will have me. Not just visits and fixed roofs, but a real life together." "I will have you," Willa said, laughing and crying at the same time. "But you do not need to make a big production of asking. I already know my answer." "I am doing it properly," Elijah insisted. "You deserve that much at least. Give me a week." He spent that week preparing, which mostly meant pacing his cabin and trying to figure out what to say. He was not good with words, had never been, and this felt too important to mess up. He crafted a ring from a piece of silver he had been saving, working the metal carefully until it formed a simple band that he hoped would fit her finger. On the 7th day, he cleaned himself up as best he could, trimmed his beard, tied his hair back, and walked down to the settlement with his heart pounding. Willa was in her garden, even though it was winter and nothing was growing, checking on the herbs she had planted the previous spring to see which ones might survive. She looked up when she heard him coming, and her face lit up in a way that made all his nervousness disappear. "Hello," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "I was wondering when you would come back." "I needed time to prepare," Elijah said. He took her hands in his, noting how small they looked engulfed by his own. "Willa Adams, I am not good at speeches or romance. I am a mountain man who is better with axes and rifles than with words. But I love you more than I thought I could love anyone. You brought me back to life when I thought I was content being dead inside. You make me want to be better, to do better, to build a future instead of just surviving each day." He released one of her hands and pulled out the silver ring, holding it up between them. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and let me spend the rest of my life loving you?" Willa was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. "Yes," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Elijah slipped the ring onto her finger, relieved when it fit perfectly, and then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly, putting all his love and hope and fear into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, Willa was laughing. "I told you that you did not need to make a production of it," she said, "but I am glad you did. That was perfect." They were married 2 weeks later by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through the territory. It was a simple ceremony at Willa's cabin, with a handful of neighbors as witnesses, and Elijah wore the only clean shirt he owned, while Willa wore a dress she had made herself from blue calico. They spoke their vows in front of the fireplace, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Elijah kissed his bride and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless since the war ended. The question of where they would live was easily answered. Willa's cabin in the settlement was too small and too exposed to the harsh Montana winters. Elijah's cabin in the mountains was larger and better built, but it was far from the people Willa needed to help as a healer. So they compromised. They would live in Elijah's cabin, but make regular trips down to the settlement, so Willa could treat her patients. Elijah would build a small shelter near the base of the mountain, where they could store supplies, and where Willa could treat emergencies when the weather was too bad to travel. They settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Willa moved her belongings up to the mountain cabin, bringing her herbs and medicines, her few books, the quilt her mother had made. Elijah made space for her things, built her shelves for her herbs and a larger table where she could work preparing medicines. They fell into routines together, rising with the sun, working through the day, talking by the fireplace at night. Winter deepened, and they were sometimes snowed in for days at a time, but neither of them minded. Elijah taught Willa how to shoot his rifle, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to read the weather in the clouds and wind. Willa taught Elijah about herbs and healing, about patience and gentleness, about letting himself feel emotions he had locked away for so long. They learned each other's bodies and hearts, building an intimacy that went beyond physical desire, though there was plenty of that too. In the spring, when the snow melted and the forest came alive with new growth, Willa discovered she was pregnant. She told Elijah one morning as they sat outside the cabin, watching the sunrise paint the peaks gold and pink. He was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on her still flat belly, and she saw tears in his eyes. "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly worried. "I never thought I would have this," Elijah said, his voice rough. "A wife, a child, a real family. I thought I had given up the right to that kind of happiness when I became the man I am." "You are a good man," Willa said firmly, taking his face in her hands. "You have always been a good man, even when you could not see it yourself. You will be a wonderful father." "I hope so," Elijah said. "I want to be, for you, for this child." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and summer. Willa continued her work as a healer, though Elijah insisted she not overexert herself. He became even more protective than before, accompanying her on every trip to the settlement, hovering over her when she worked in the garden or prepared medicines. Willa tolerated his overprotectiveness with good humor, knowing it came from love rather than a desire to control. As autumn arrived again, painting the aspens gold and sending the elk into rut, Willa's belly grew round and heavy. She moved more slowly now, tiring easily, and Elijah took over more of the daily chores. He chopped extra wood for the winter, hunted and preserved meat, made sure their supplies were well stocked. He also prepared a cradle, carving it carefully from pine and sanding it smooth, adding a design of mountains and trees along the headboard. Their son was born on a cold November night while snow fell softly outside. Elijah helped deliver him, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he caught the baby and laid him on Willa's chest. The child was healthy and loud, announcing his arrival with strong cries, and when Elijah looked at his wife holding their son, he felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it almost frightened him. "What should we name him?" Willa asked, exhausted but radiant. "You choose," Elijah said. "I trust you." "William," Willa decided. "After my father, William Lang." Elijah nodded, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "Welcome to the world, William Lang. Your mother and I are going to do our best to raise you right." William proved to be a good baby, healthy and curious, with his mother's honey-colored eyes and his father's dark hair. Elijah was terrified of him at first, afraid his large hands would somehow hurt the small creature. But Willa showed him how to hold the baby properly, how to change him and feed him and soothe him when he cried. Soon Elijah was carrying William around in a sling Willa made, the tiny baby secure against his broad chest while he did his chores. The winter was long but peaceful. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, the three of them cozy in the cabin while storms raged outside. Elijah told William stories about the forest and the animals, even though the baby was too young to understand. Willa sang lullabies her mother had taught her, old songs from Pennsylvania that spoke of green hills and gentle rain. They were a family, isolated in their mountain cabin, and they were happy. Spring came again, and with it new challenges. William was crawling now, getting into everything, and the cabin suddenly seemed too small. Elijah began planning an addition, extra rooms they would need as William grew and possibly for other children if they were blessed with more. He spent the summer working on the addition whenever he had spare time, hauling logs and setting foundations, while Willa tended William and her garden and her patients in the settlement. It was during this time that trouble came back to their lives in the form of the two miners who had accosted Willa 2 years earlier. They had apparently been away working claims in Idaho and had only recently returned to the Montana Territory. They came to the settlement asking questions about Willa, about where she lived now, and word eventually reached Elijah about their interest. He told Willa to stay at the cabin with William while he went to deal with the situation. She protested, worried about what he might do, but Elijah was firm. "This is my job," he said, "to protect you and our son. Those men scared you before, and I will not let them do it again. Trust me to handle this." Ably. He found the miners in Virginia City, in a saloon where they were drinking and playing cards. Elijah walked up to their table and stood there until they noticed him, his presence impossible to ignore. "You have been asking about my wife," Elijah said quietly. "I would like to know why." The taller miner recognized him immediately and went pale. "We were just asking, that is all. Did not mean any harm. You followed her up a mountain and scared her badly enough that she still sometimes has nightmares about it," Elijah said, his voice deadly calm. "That sounds like harm to me. Look, we were drunk that day. We did not know she was spoken for. It was a mistake." "Yes, it was," Elijah agreed. "And you are going to make sure you never make that mistake again. You are going to leave this territory and not come back. If I hear you have been asking about my wife again, if I hear you have bothered any woman in this territory, I will track you down and you will not like what happens next. Are we clear?" Both men nodded rapidly, nearly falling over themselves to agree. Elijah turned and walked out of the saloon, his heart pounding but his hand steady. He had not threatened them with specific violence, had not even raised his voice, but they had understood the danger. That was enough. When he returned to the cabin and told Willa what had happened, she hugged him tightly. "Thank you for not doing anything you would regret," she said, "for handling it without violence." "I learned that from you," Elijah said, wrapping his arms around her. "You have taught me that there are better ways to solve problems than with fists and guns. I am still learning, but I am trying." The years passed peacefully after that. Elijah finished the addition to the cabin, giving them proper bedrooms and more space. William grew from a baby into a bright, curious boy who loved the forest as much as his parents did. Elijah taught him to track animals and identify plants, while Willa taught him to read and write and appreciate books. The settlement at the base of the mountain grew larger, becoming a proper town with a general store and a church, and Willa's reputation as a healer spread throughout the region. When William was 4 years old, Willa gave birth to twin girls, Elizabeth and Eleanor, who had their father's dark hair and their mother's quick smile. The cabin was suddenly full of noise and chaos and laughter, and Elijah found himself wondering how he had ever thought he wanted solitude. This was what he had been missing all those years alone on his mountain. The sound of children playing, his wife singing while she worked, the feeling of being part of something larger than himself. More years passed. William grew tall and strong like his father, though he had his mother's gentle temperament. The twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into mischief together. Elijah expanded the cabin again, adding a workspace where Willa could see patients without them having to come all the way up the mountain in bad weather. He no longer trapped as much, instead making his living as a carpenter and builder, using the skills he had learned before the war. People in the growing town knew Elijah Lang as a fair man, quiet but reliable, someone you could count on in a crisis. They knew better than to bother him unnecessarily or to threaten his family, but they also knew he would be the first to help if you needed assistance building a barn or finding a lost child. He was respected, even liked, though he still preferred the company of his family to anyone else. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Elijah and Willa took a rare afternoon alone together, leaving the children with a trusted neighbor. They walked to the creek where he had first found her gathering herbs, and they sat on the bank in the sunshine, watching the water flow past. "Do you ever regret letting me stay that first day?" Willa asked, leaning against his shoulder. "When you could have sent me away and kept your solitary life." Elijah wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Not for 1 second," he said. "You gave me back my life, Willa. You gave me a reason to be part of the world again instead of hiding from it. You gave me love and children and a purpose beyond just surviving. I cannot imagine what my life would have been without you." "I think you would have figured it out eventually," Willa said. "You are stronger than you believe." "Maybe," Elijah allowed, "but it would have taken much longer and I would have been miserable the whole time. I am glad you trespassed in my forest. I am glad I was too curious about you to send you away. I am glad for every single day we have had together." "Even the hard days?" Willa asked. "The times when William was colicky or the twins were fighting or money was tight." "Especially those days," Elijah said. "Because we got through them together. That is what matters. Not that life is always easy, but that we face it as a team." They sat together in silence for a while, comfortable in each other's presence the way only people who have truly known each other can be. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of late summer. Birds singing, insects humming, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was the same forest where Elijah had spent years alone, but it was different now because he was different. He had been transformed by love, softened and strengthened at the same time, and he was grateful for every day of that transformation. As they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, Elijah thought about the scared, broken man he had been when he first came to these mountains. That man had believed he deserved only solitude and silence, that he was too damaged for anything else. But Willa had seen past the damage to the man underneath, and she had loved him anyway. She had given him the courage to love himself, to forgive himself, to build a life worth living. The children were playing outside when they got home, William teaching the twins how to identify animal tracks in the dirt. Elijah stood watching them, Willa beside him, and felt the fullness of his contentment. This was enough. This was more than enough. This was everything he had never dared to dream he could have. Years continued to flow past like the creek through their forest. William grew into a young man, strong and capable, choosing to become a doctor and study in Denver, inspired by his mother's healing work. The twins grew into lovely young women, Elizabeth becoming a teacher in the town's new school, while Alina followed her father's footsteps as a carpenter and builder. The cabin that had started as Elijah's lonely outpost became the heart of a large, loving family that included grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. Elijah and Willa grew old together, their hair turning gray, their hands becoming weathered with age but still fitting perfectly together. Elijah's muscles, though no longer quite as powerful as in his youth, remained strong from a lifetime of physical work. He moved a bit slower now, but he still walked the forest trails with Willa, still showed the grandchildren the places where the best herbs grew, still protected his family with the same fierce dedication he always had. On a warm summer evening when Elijah was 70 years old and Willa was 62, they sat together on the porch he had built onto the cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. 3 of their grandchildren were playing in the yard while William and his wife prepared dinner inside. The twins were expected for Sunday supper along with their families. The cabin would soon be full of noise and laughter and love. "You remember the day we met?" Willa asked, her hand in his as it had been for nearly 40 years. "Every detail," Elijah said. "You were kneeling by the creek, digging up wild ginger. You had dirt on your knees and determination in your eyes. I thought about sending you away, but something stopped me." "What stopped you?" Willa asked, though she had asked this question before over the years. "I think I knew even then that you were going to change everything," Elijah said. "I think some part of me recognized that you were what I had been missing, what I needed, even though I had convinced myself I wanted to be alone. Fate," Willa said softly, "or providence, or just dumb luck that I happened to choose your forest to trespass in." "Whatever it was, I am grateful for it," Elijah said. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Thank you for trespassing, Willa Lang. Thank you for staying." "Thank you for letting me stay," Willa said, tears in her eyes though she was smiling. "Thank you for seeing past my trespassing to the person I was. Thank you for loving me." "Always," Elijah promised. "From that first day to my last day, always." They sat together as the sun set and the stars came out, surrounded by the family they had built together, in the forest that had brought them together. Elijah thought about the long, lonely years before Willa, and he thought about all the rich, full years since. He thought about how close he had come to sending her away that first day, to missing out on everything that mattered most. But he had not sent her away. He had let her stay, and she had changed everything. She had taken a broken mountain man hiding from the world and had loved him back to life. She had given him family and purpose and joy. She had taught him that he deserved happiness, that his past did not define his future, that love was always worth the risk. As they went inside to join their family for dinner, Elijah wrapped his arm around Willa's shoulders, pulling her close. She fit against his side as perfectly as she had 40 years ago, and he knew with absolute certainty that letting her stay was the best decision he had ever made. She had been trespassing in his forest, but she had found her way into his heart, and he had never wanted her to leave. Their story had started with a chance meeting by a creek in the Montana wilderness. With a mountain man and a healer and the herbs that grew in the forest they both loved. It had grown into a love that lasted a lifetime, into a family that would continue long after they were gone, into a legacy of kindness and strength and choosing love over fear. And it had all begun because Elijah Lang had found a woman gathering herbs in his forest, had recognized her trespassing for what it truly was, an invitation to rejoin the world, and had made the simple but profound decision to let her stay. Not just that day, but always. Forever. For the rest of their lives together in the mountains, they both called home. The end came gently for them both, as these things sometimes do for people who have lived good lives and loved well. Elijah went first, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Willa holding his hand. She followed him 6 months later. Her children and grandchildren gathered around, and they buried her beside him on the hill, overlooking the creek where they first met. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through generations, a testament to what had started that day when a mountain man found a healer trespassing in his forest and made the choice that changed both their lives. The forest still grew wild around it, and wild ginger still flourished by the creek, and those who lived there told the story of Elijah and Willa to their children and grandchildren, a love story born in the wild Montana mountains that lasted forever.